If you want to understand the story of Aileen Wuornos, the woman who would eventually become one of the most infamous female serial killers in American history, you have to go all the way back to the beginning. Because the truth is, Aileen didn't suddenly become violent one day. She didn't wake up and decide she was going to kill. Her story is one of wounds upon wounds, of a life that seemed doomed long before she ever held a gun in her hands. And to grasp why she clung so desperately to Tyria Moore, why she believed she was killing for love, you first have to step into the world she was born into. Aileen was born in 1956 in Rochester, Michigan, and right from the moment she came into the world, life stacked the deck against her. Her mother, Diane, was just a teenager, emotionally unprepared, financially unstable, and overwhelmed by the chaos of her own life. Her father, Leo Dale Pittman, wasn't around because he was already behind bars. A convicted sex offender with a violent history, Leo would later take his own life in prison. Aileen never met him, but his darkness hung over her life like a shadow she could never shake off. By the time Aileen turned 4, her mother abandoned her and her brother, just walked away, left them with their grandparents, Lori and Britta. And while some foster scenarios feel like a second chance, Aileen's wasn't. Her grandfather was strict, angry, and often violent. He ruled the house with fists, belts, and fear. Her grandmother struggled with alcoholism and frequent illnesses, leaving no emotional safety in the home. The children were living inside a storm with no shelter. Aileen was still just a little girl when the abuse began, physical, emotional, and by some reports, sexual. She spent her childhood feeling unwanted, unprotected, and unheard. Aileen learned early that the world was a cold place, that no one was coming to rescue her, and that pain was something you learned to swallow. By the time she was 11, she had already begun drifting away from childhood and into survival mode. She'd sit in the woods behind her house, smoking cigarettes, drinking beer, and experimenting with anything that could numb her pain. She found herself exchanging sexual favors for food, cigarettes, and even rides. No one guided her. No one hugged her. No one told her she deserved better. All she had was the cold Michigan air, the sound of the trees, and the feeling that she didn't belong anywhere. At 14, she became pregnant after being sexually assaulted. Her son was taken from her immediately at birth and given up for adoption. She never held him, never got to see him. Another deep wound carved into her heart. At 15, her grandmother died. At 16, her grandfather kicked her out of the house. Just like that. She was homeless, living in the woods, sleeping in abandoned cars, and surviving off scraps. She had no family, no money, no direction. She had become a ghost in her own life. Her existence depended on what she could hustle from the world, and the world gave her nothing but bruises in return. By the time she drifted her way to Florida, she was hardened, but also still desperately longing for something she had never truly received: affection. Someone to look at her and say, "You matter." Someone to choose her. Someone to stay. This craving for love wasn't just a desire. It was a gaping hole inside of her, carved out from childhood and left raw and bleeding for decades. She would do anything to fill it. But the problem was, Aileen didn't know what healthy love looked like. In her mind, love was tangled with pain. Love was something you fought for, lied for, suffered for. Love was survival. Love was clinging to someone because being alone felt like death. So when she met Tyria Moore in 1986 at a Daytona gay bar, something inside Aileen shifted. For the first time in her life, she felt chosen, seen, wanted. Tyria wasn't just a girlfriend. She was the answer to years of loneliness. Tyria represented safety, stability, and affection, all the things Aileen had been starved of since childhood. Their relationship wasn't smooth or peaceful. It was chaotic, intense, and filled with emotional highs and lows. But for Aileen, it was everything she had ever dreamed of. She loved hard, clung harder, and feared losing Tyria more than anything else. This desperation wasn't romantic, it was psychological. Aileen believed that if Tyria left her, she would crumble, that she would go back to the empty, cold, lonely version of herself she had spent her whole life trying to escape. Tyria was her lifeline, her anchor, her entire reason to get up every morning. And Aileen would do anything, to keep that feeling of being wanted. So when money got tight, when the electricity bill came, when they couldn't pay rent, Aileen didn't look at prostitution as a choice. She saw it as her responsibility, her sacrifice, her way to ensure Tyria would never leave her. And when some of those men became violent or threatening, when Aileen claimed she needed to kill to protect herself, part of that belief was tied to protecting Tyria as well. Aileen wasn't just fighting for survival. She thought she was fighting for love. Because when you've spent your whole life being abandoned, hurt, and thrown aside, when the world has treated you like you're disposable, the moment someone shows you affection, even flawed affection, you cling to it like oxygen. Aileen's entire story, her childhood, her homelessness, her violence, her killings, is rooted in one foundational truth. She never felt loved. Not once. Not truly. Until Tyria. And that desperation to hold onto that feeling, even if it was slipping through her fingers, shaped every decision she made after. Aileen wasn't just a woman who killed. She was a woman who had been broken long before she ever picked up a gun. And her hunger for love, the kind she never received, became the fuel behind a tragedy that would shock America. If Aileen Wuornos's childhood explains why she was broken, then her relationship with Tyria Moore explains why everything eventually exploded. Because this wasn't an ordinary love story. This wasn't two people finding comfort and building a future together. This was a relationship built on emotional hunger, dependency, fear of abandonment, and a desperate need to be loved at any cost. And when love becomes survival, it stops being love, it becomes obsession. When Aileen met Tyria Moore in 1986 at a gay bar in Daytona Beach, Florida, something rare happened in her life. Someone didn't turn away. Someone didn't judge her past, her rough edges, her scars. Tyria listened. Tyria stayed. And for Aileen, that alone was enough to change everything. Tyria Moore was quieter than Aileen, more reserved. She wasn't aggressive or explosive. She had her own struggles, her own insecurities. But compared to Aileen, she seemed stable, calm, grounded. And that difference created a powerful imbalance from the very beginning. Aileen poured herself into the relationship with a level of intensity that can only come from someone who has never felt secure before. For the first time in her life, Aileen felt chosen. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was belonging. The two women quickly became inseparable. They lived together, moved from place to place, shared meals, shared beds, shared dreams of a better life. To outsiders, they looked like two lost souls, clinging to each other in a tough world. But beneath the surface, the emotional dynamics were already dangerous. Aileen loved Tyria more than she loved herself. In fact, you could argue she didn't love herself at all. Tyria became her emotional anchor, her identity, her reason to exist. And when you put that much weight on one person, it creates pressure that slowly poisons everything. Money became the first crack. Neither woman had stable work. Bills piled up. Motels cost money. Food cost money. And Aileen, carrying the belief that she had to provide to be worthy of love, returned to prostitution. But in her mind, this wasn't shameful. This was sacrifice. This was proof of devotion. She told herself, I'm doing this for us. Every time she walked out the door at night, she wasn't just selling her body. She was buying safety, stability, and the hope that Tyria wouldn't leave. And Tyria, whether knowingly or not, benefited from that sacrifice. The money Aileen brought home paid for their shared life. And as long as that money kept coming, the relationship continued. But here's where things get darker. Aileen's emotions were unpredictable. She had deep anger toward men, anger rooted in years of abuse, exploitation, and trauma. Each encounter brought that rage closer to the surface. And Tyria, instead of grounding Aileen or pushing her toward safety, remained emotionally distant. She didn't confront the danger. She didn't ask hard questions. She didn't pull Aileen back. Instead, she stayed silent. That silence mattered, because Aileen interpreted it as acceptance, approval, loyalty. In her mind, everything she did, every risk, every violent act, was justified if it meant protecting their life together. And as the violence escalated, so did her emotional dependence. The more unstable she became, the more she clung to Tyria. This wasn't a partnership anymore. It was a psychological bond built on fear of abandonment. Aileen feared one thing more than prison, more than death, being alone again. So when the murders began, Aileen didn't see herself as a monster. She saw herself as a protector. She believed she was absorbing the danger, so Tyria could live safely. She believed she was strong enough to carry the weight of violence if it meant Tyria would stay. And Tyria? That's the most complicated part of the story. Tyria didn't pull the trigger. She didn't commit the murders. But she also didn't leave. She stayed beside Aileen through growing instability, unexplained money, strange behavior, and dangerous patterns. Whether she knew the full truth or not, she benefited from it. And that creates a moral gray area that still fuels debate today. Some believe Tyria was manipulated and afraid. Others believe she knew more than she ever admitted. But what's undeniable is that her presence reinforced Aileen's behavior. As long as Tyria stayed, Aileen believed everything was worth it. This kind of love is not romantic, it's destructive. It's the kind of bond where one person disappears inside the other, where self-worth becomes conditional, where I love you silently turns into I can't survive without you. And that's exactly what happened. When police pressure finally closed in, when the walls started to collapse, Tyria made a choice that revealed the truth of the relationship. Faced with prison herself, she chose survival. She cooperated with investigators. She agreed to record phone calls. She agreed to help trap Aileen. And when Tyria called her, crying, pretending to be terrified of arrest, Aileen didn't hesitate. She said, "I'll take the blame. Don't worry." That one sentence exposes everything. Aileen was willing to die for Tyria. Tyria was willing to let her. That's not love. That's imbalance. That's emotional collapse. When Aileen realized the betrayal later, it shattered her completely. But even then, she never stopped claiming she loved Tyria. Even on death row, she spoke of her as the only person who ever truly mattered. Because for Aileen, love wasn't about equality or safety. It was about attachment. And once attached, she couldn't let go, even when it destroyed her. This relationship didn't cause the violence by itself, but it gave the violence a purpose in Aileen's mind. It gave her something to fight for, something to justify the darkness inside her. And that's why the bond between Aileen Wuornos and Tyria Moore remains one of the most disturbing romantic relationships in American crime history. Not because it was passionate, but because it was built on emotional wounds that never healed. It shows us something uncomfortable about love. When someone is broken enough, love doesn't save them. Sometimes it becomes the weapon that finishes the job. To understand how Aileen Wuornos crossed the line from desperation into murder, you have to understand the emotional storm she was living inside. By the late 1980s, Aileen wasn't just struggling to survive. She was drowning in fear, anger, and pressure. Money was running out. Stability felt temporary. And the one thing she believed gave her life meaning, her relationship with Tyria, felt constantly at risk. In Aileen's mind, everything she did was tied to one goal: keep their life together from falling apart. Florida highways became the backdrop to that unraveling. Nights were long, uncertain, and dangerous. Aileen went out believing she had no other options. Each encounter carried years of trauma with it, memories of abuse, exploitation, and humiliation. Those memories didn't fade, they sharpened. They shaped how she saw men, how she anticipated threat, how quickly fear could turn into rage. And over time, fear and rage fused into something explosive. Aileen later claimed that the first killing was self-defense. She said she was attacked, that her life was in danger. Investigators would debate the truth of that claim for years. But what matters for understanding the escalation is how Aileen processed that moment afterward. Instead of stopping, instead of turning to authorities or leaving the life she was living, she continued. Something inside her shifted. The boundary that once existed, however fragile, collapsed. Money followed the violence. After each killing, there were stolen items, cars, cash, belongings that could be sold. Those things paid for motel rooms, food, drinks, and a temporary sense of security. And that's where the justification took hold. In Aileen's mind, these acts weren't random. They were transactional. She believed she was providing. She believed she was protecting the life she shared with Tyria. Every dollar felt like proof that she was useful, necessary, indispensable. As the months passed, the pattern became clearer. Men were picked up along the roadways. Encounters happened in isolated places. Aileen carried a gun, and the presence of that weapon changed everything. It gave her a sense of control she'd never had before. For someone who spent her life powerless, control felt intoxicating. It didn't just protect her, it empowered her. And empowerment, mixed with unresolved trauma, can become dangerously addictive. What's important to understand is that Aileen didn't see herself as a predator. She saw herself as reacting to a hostile world. She believed men were threats by default. She believed violence was inevitable. And once you believe something is inevitable, you stop questioning it. You stop imagining alternatives. You stop seeing a way out. Each killing reinforced the next. Not because Aileen enjoyed it in a traditional sense, but because it solved immediate problems. Bills got paid. Fear subsided temporarily. Tyria stayed. That reinforcement loop, problem, violence, relief, tightened its grip. And with each repetition, the emotional distance between Aileen and the reality of her actions grew wider. Meanwhile, Tyria remained close. Whether she knew the full truth or only fragments, her presence mattered. Every time Aileen came back with money, every time the night ended without consequences, it confirmed Eileen's belief that she was doing what needed to be done. Silence can be powerful. Silence can feel like permission. As the body count rose, so did the pressure. Police across Florida began to connect the dots. Similarities emerged. Witnesses came forward. Composite sketches circulated. Aileen felt the heat closing in. Paranoia crept into everyday moments. She watched cars in her rearview mirror. She listened for footsteps in motel hallways. She drank more. Her mood swung faster. The world felt like it was hunting her, and in a way it was. That paranoia fed the violence. When you're constantly expecting danger, you react faster and harder. You assume the worst. You stop giving the benefit of the doubt. And for Aileen, who already believed the world was out to hurt her, that mindset made restraint nearly impossible. Yet through all of this, her focus remained narrow. Tyria, the relationship, the fear of losing it. Aileen talked about building a future, about saving enough money to start over somewhere new. These plans weren't realistic, but they were emotionally necessary. They gave the violence a narrative, a story she could tell herself to make sense of the chaos. Investigators later described the killings as escalating not just in number, but in confidence. Aileen moved faster. She took more risks. The crimes became less about immediate fear and more about maintaining the life she thought she was protecting. That's how survival turns into habit. That's how desperation turns into momentum. When the arrests finally began, when law enforcement zeroed in on her identity, the illusion shattered. The life she'd been fighting to preserve was already slipping away. And yet, even then, Eileen's loyalty didn't waver. She continued to frame everything as necessary, justified, protective. Looking back, it's clear that the murders weren't driven by a single motive. They were the result of many forces colliding at once: trauma, poverty, addiction, fear, rage, and a deep emotional dependence on one person. Remove any one of those factors, and the outcome might have been different. But together, they formed a perfect storm. This phase of Eileen's story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. That violence can grow quietly. That desperation can normalize the unthinkable. And that when someone believes their worth depends on what they can provide, especially in a relationship, they may cross lines they never imagined. Aileen Wuornos didn't wake up planning a killing spree. But step by step, choice by choice, she built a reality where murder felt like the only way to keep going. Not because it was right, not because it was justified, but because, in her fractured understanding of love and survival, it felt necessary. And once necessity becomes belief, belief becomes action. And action, repeated enough times, becomes tragedy. As the pressure around Aileen Wuornos intensified, the story quietly shifted away from highways and motel rooms and moved into something far more intimate and devastating. This part of the story doesn't unfold with gunshots or flashing lights. It unfolds through fear, choices, and a single relationship that was already cracking under the weight of secrets. And at the center of it all was Tyria Moore. By the time law enforcement began to seriously connect the murders, Tyria was no longer living comfortably beside Aileen. She had started to sense that something was deeply wrong. Money appeared suddenly and disappeared just as fast. Eileen's moods were unpredictable, swinging from affectionate to paranoid in a matter of minutes. There were stories that didn't add up, explanations that felt rehearsed, and an undercurrent of danger that Tyria could no longer ignore. When investigators finally identified Tyria as someone close to the suspect they were chasing, they didn't rush in with threats or accusations. They approached carefully, calmly. They understood that Tyria wasn't just a witness. She was the emotional center of Eileen's world, and that made her the key. Tyria was tracked down and brought in for questioning. At first, she denied knowing anything significant. She claimed ignorance, confusion, emotional exhaustion, and in many ways, that wasn't entirely untrue. She may not have known every detail, every act, every consequence, but she knew enough to feel afraid. Afraid of Aileen. Afraid of the truth. Afraid of what would happen if she stayed loyal. That fear became the turning point. Investigators made it clear to Tyria that her future depended on cooperation. They laid out what they knew. They showed her evidence. They explained the seriousness of the situation and what could happen if she continued to protect someone suspected of multiple murders. Tyria was cornered in a way Aileen never was. She was being forced to choose between survival and loyalty, and Tyria chose survival. The plan law enforcement came up with was simple, but emotionally brutal. Tyria would call Aileen. She would tell her she was scared, that police were watching her, that she needed Aileen to explain everything so they could figure out what to do next. It was a performance designed to exploit the one thing Aileen trusted without question, Tyria's love. When that phone call happened, it wasn't just a conversation. It was a trap disguised as intimacy. Aileen didn't hesitate. She poured everything out. She spoke openly, emotionally, urgently. She reassured Tyria. She justified herself. She framed the killings as acts of protection, of necessity, of love. She spoke the way someone speaks when they believe they are finally being understood. Every word was recorded, every admission carefully captured. What makes this moment so haunting isn't just that Aileen confessed. It's that she did so because she believed she was saving the relationship. She thought this honesty would bring them closer, would help them escape together, would prove that everything she'd done was for us. Meanwhile, Tyria sat on the other end of the line, listening, knowing that every word was sealing Eileen's fate. After the call, Tyria stepped fully into cooperation. She provided information, timelines, and details that helped investigators build an airtight case. In exchange, she received immunity. She walked away free. No charges, no prison sentence, just the lifelong weight of knowing how her freedom was secured. When Aileen was arrested, the betrayal hit harder than the handcuffs. At first, she refused to believe it. She insisted Tyria had been forced, manipulated, threatened. She clung to the idea that Tyria still loved her, that this was all a misunderstanding. Even in custody, even faced with overwhelming evidence, Eileen's emotional loyalty remained intact. But slowly, reality sank in. Aileen learned the truth about the phone call, about the deal, about Tyria's cooperation, and something inside her broke in a way it never had before. Rage flared, yes, but beneath it was devastation. The kind that comes when the one person you built your entire identity around walks away. From that moment on, Eileen's tone changed. She became more volatile, more defiant, more detached. She no longer spoke about saving the relationship. She spoke about betrayal, about abandonment, about how love had once again turned into loss. Tyria, on the other hand, disappeared from public life. She avoided media. She avoided interviews. She changed locations, while Aileen became one of the most infamous figures in American criminal history. Tyria faded into obscurity. Some see her as a victim who did what she had to do. Others see her as someone who benefited from silence until it was no longer safe. The truth likely sits somewhere in between. What's undeniable is that this betrayal was the emotional climax of the entire case. Not the murders, not the arrest, but the moment when Aileen realized that everything she thought, she was protecting was already gone. In court, Tyria never took the stand in the way many expected. Her absence was as loud as her cooperation. And Aileen noticed. She spoke about it. She fixated on it. She framed herself as the one who took all the blame, while Tyria walked free. Whether that was fair or not, it was how Aileen made sense of her ending. This part of the story forces uncomfortable questions. How much responsibility does love carry? When does loyalty become complicity? And when survival is on the line, what does betrayal really mean? For Aileen, Tyria's choice confirmed her darkest belief, that love is temporary, conditional, and ultimately self-serving. That belief didn't just shape her crimes. It shaped how she faced her punishment. For Tyria, the choice meant freedom, but at the cost of a lifetime of association with one of America's most notorious killers. No matter how far she ran, that story followed. In the end, this wasn't just a legal turning point. It was a psychological one. The moment when the emotional foundation of Aileen Wuornos's life collapsed completely. After that, nothing mattered the same way again. By the time Aileen Wuornos fully confessed, the story had already moved beyond crime and into something far darker and more complex. The highways were behind her. The motel rooms were gone. The gun was no longer in her hands. What remained was a woman sitting alone with the weight of her own life, finally forced to face what she had become and how she would be remembered. After her arrest, Aileen initially tried to control the narrative. She spoke openly, sometimes aggressively, sometimes emotionally, insisting that she had acted in self-defense. She described the men she killed as threats, as attackers, as symbols of everything that had hurt her before. In her mind, these weren't random acts of violence. They were reactions. Justified, necessary, protective. But as the legal process moved forward, those explanations began to crumble under evidence, testimony, and time. Slowly, Aileen's tone changed. The defiance faded. The anger became less focused. And what replaced it was something harder to watch: resignation. She stopped trying to convince the world she was innocent and began accepting that this was how her story would end. Not because she suddenly believed the system was fair, but because she was exhausted. Emotionally, mentally, spiritually. During interrogations and interviews, Aileen spoke with startling clarity about her life. She talked about abandonment, abuse, betrayal, and loneliness as if they were old companions. She didn't romanticize her past. She didn't soften it. If anything, she seemed determined to make sure people understood that her crimes didn't come from nowhere. They came from years of being unheard. In court, Aileen became unpredictable. Sometimes calm, sometimes explosive. She made statements that shocked the public and confused even her own defense team. At times, she claimed responsibility without hesitation. At other times, she lashed out at the system, the media, and society itself. Watching her was like watching someone unravel in real time, caught between clarity and collapse. What made her case so disturbing to many observers wasn't just the violence, it was the psychology. Aileen didn't fit the traditional image of a serial killer. She wasn't methodical in the way people expected. She wasn't emotionally detached. She was chaotic, reactive, deeply wounded. Her crimes felt less like calculated evil and more like a life spiraling out of control with no safety net. Mental health professionals who evaluated her noted signs of severe psychological damage. Years of trauma had shaped her worldview. She saw danger everywhere. She trusted almost no one. And when she did trust, she attached completely, desperately. Losing Tyria wasn't just heartbreak. It was the collapse of the one emotional structure holding her together. As her execution date approached, Aileen's mindset grew darker and more detached. She began making statements that suggested paranoia, anger at the system, and a belief that the world was better off without her. Some interpreted this as acceptance. Others saw it as the final stage of emotional burnout. She refused further appeals. She waived opportunities to delay her execution. To some, this looked like courage. To others, it looked like surrender. But in Aileen's own words, she was done fighting. She no longer believed in redemption. She no longer believed anyone was listening. Ending it felt easier than continuing to exist in a world she felt had already rejected her. In her final interviews, Aileen spoke in ways that were unsettling and tragic at the same time. She talked about betrayal, about corruption, about how love had ruined her life. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't beg for sympathy. Instead, she framed her death as inevitable, almost necessary, as if it were the final chapter she'd been moving toward all along. When the execution finally took place in 2002, it was quiet, clinical, final. There were no dramatic last-minute rescues, no confessions that changed history, just a woman whose life had been marked by violence from beginning to end, meeting a system designed to respond to violence with death. Afterward, the public reaction was divided. Some felt justice had been served. Others felt uneasy, not because her crimes weren't horrific, but because the story raised questions that had no easy answers. Could anything have changed her path? Could intervention, care, or support earlier in her life have prevented this outcome? Or was the damage too deep by the time anyone noticed? Aileen Wuornos became a symbol. To some, she was a monster. To others, she was a victim who became something terrifying. Her story forced society to confront uncomfortable truths about trauma, mental illness, poverty, and how easily people fall through the cracks. Even today, her name still sparks debate. Films, documentaries, and books continue to revisit her life, each trying to answer the same impossible question. How does someone become this? And was there ever a moment where things could have gone differently? What makes her story linger isn't just what she did, but how human she remained through it all. Flawed, angry, hurt, desperate for love, and ultimately alone. In the end, Aileen didn't die as a mystery. She died as a warning, a reminder that when pain is ignored long enough, it doesn't disappear, it transforms. And sometimes, that transformation leaves devastation in its wake. Her story doesn't ask us to excuse her crimes, but it does force us to look deeper, to question how society defines evil, to recognize that monsters are often made, not born, and to understand that the line between victim and villain can be thinner than we want to believe. That's why her case remains one of America's most infamous romantic crime stories. Not because it's sensational, but because it's tragic. From beginning to end,